Wild Bill Hickok's reputation was never built on carrying the most modern weapon in reach. It was built on carrying what he knew, carrying it the same way, and trusting that familiarity when distance, pressure, and noise made other men hurry. That is the edge behind the legend and behind the shot remembered as a 75-yard heart shot. If you strip away the stories that grew larger every time they were retold, what remains is even more interesting. A man whose loadout made sense, whose habits were consistent, and whose success came less from mystery than from repetition. He became frightening because his weapons, his hands, and his judgment worked together as one system. To understand why that system held up for so long, you have to look at what he carried, how he carried it, and why he refused to abandon it even when newer options appeared. Before the name hardened into myth, the foundation was simpler. Hickok came out of a rough, practical world where skill with animals, movement, and weapons mattered early. He was not shaped in a drawing room. He was shaped in a life where competence had visible consequences, where hesitation cost you, and where the difference between confidence and panic could be measured in one decision. That matters because legends often make a gunfighter sound as if he arrived fully formed. He did not. He learned in layers. First came comfort around weapons as tools, then came the understanding that tools carried for food or work were not always enough when conflict became personal. By the time his name began to circulate, the real advantage was already in place. He had trained himself to rely on familiar motion under stress, and that habit would define every weapon choice that followed. As his life moved into harsher ground, danger stopped being abstract. Opportunity, disorder, and conflict pulled him toward work that demanded more than ordinary toughness. In that shift, the logic of the loadout changed. A firearm was no longer just something that might be useful, it became part of daily readiness. The more public his role became, the less room there was for improvisation. People who might want to test him, embarrass him, or kill him did not announce themselves first. That is why his system tightened rather than expanded into novelty. Instead of chasing every new promise in metal and marketing, he leaned toward what could be reached quickly, what could be aimed by feel as much as sight, and what he could trust after long repetition. That transition is the first real key. Hickok did not become dangerous because he loved weapons. He became dangerous because he understood when a weapon had to stop being an accessory and start becoming an extension of routine. In that rising phase, he also stepped into roles that tied weapons to responsibility. Whether he was acting as a protector, a scout, a carrier of authority, or simply a man expected to hold steady when other people broke, the pressure changed the meaning of every item he carried. Reputation begins there. Not in posters, not in legend, in the repeated fact that others start looking at one person when the room tightens. The early relationships around him mattered too because reputation is never private for long. It is observed, repeated, and sharpened by witnesses, allies, rivals, and employers. Once people begin telling the same story about your nerve, your loadout starts speaking before you do. That creates a new problem. Every visible weapon now has two jobs. It must work in the hand, and it must signal that the hand carrying it is not easily shaken. Hickok's gear served both purposes, and that double meaning would help carry his image farther than the sound of any single shot. At the beginning, the line between hunting arms and fighting arms could blur. A useful long gun or an everyday sidearm might do both jobs well enough. But as the environment around Hickok grew more volatile, well enough stopped being good enough. A weapon chosen for general utility is not always a weapon optimized for sudden violence at close range. That is the point where the loadout matured. The shift was from broad usefulness to deliberate readiness. If a confrontation came fast, the answer could not be something awkward to reach, slow to present, or unfamiliar in recoil and balance. That is how the dedicated sidearm moves to the center of the story. The logic is plain. When the threat is near, the weapon on the body matters more than the weapon leaning elsewhere. Hickok's choices show exactly that progression. As his public role expanded, the sidearm stopped being a backup to life and became the central tool that protected it. One of the early tests that helped define this dependence came in a contested survival episode, the kind history never preserves with perfect agreement. The details around such moments often split between formal record, self-serving memory, and later embellishment. What matters for the loadout is the pattern those disputed accounts still reveal. When confusion hits, firearms do not always behave as planned. A long arm can be empty, fouled, out of position, or too slow in cramped conditions. Distance can collapse without warning. In moments like that, survival leans toward the secondary weapon and the practiced hand that can bring it into the fight without thought. That is why Hickok's reliance on sidearms was not ornamental. It was practical, forged in situations where there was no time to admire a weapon, only time to use it. Even when the surrounding story is argued over, the lesson stays consistent. His system assumed failure points, and he carried accordingly. The sidearms at the center of that system were not random picks. Hickok became closely identified with a matched pair of revolvers carried for immediate use and worn in a way that turned draw into muscle memory. The carry itself mattered almost as much as the guns. He favored a style that let the hand meet the grip naturally with minimal wasted movement and a clean path out of the holster. That kind of consistency is not glamorous until the instant it becomes decisive. Then it is everything. A matched pair also gave him something every practical gunfighter wanted, whether he said it out loud or not. Symmetry, same feel, same reach, same balance, same expected behavior. In a crisis, sameness reduces thinking. The hand does not have to translate between two different tools. Hickok's sidearms became central to his identity because they were not just weapons he owned. They were weapons he had absorbed into habit. Their practical strengths fit that purpose. Revolvers of that familiar type offered a balance many shooters trusted. Enough barrel and sighting plane to reward deliberate aim, enough handiness to clear leather quickly, and enough controllability to keep the gun from fighting its own owner. They were not the fastest miracle machines that later imagination sometimes prefers. They were dependable within the skill set of the man carrying them, and dependability is never just a factory trait. It is built by handling, maintenance, loading habits, and constant correction. A gun that is always carried the same way, checked the same way, and practiced the same way becomes more predictable under stress. Hickok understood that. Accounts of his image often focus on appearance, but the deeper story is discipline. Reliable field performance did not come from posing with a revolver. It came from knowing its weight, knowing its timing, and keeping its condition inside a narrow range of familiarity. The weapon worked because the owner refused to let it become strange in his hand. That is also why he stayed loyal to the setup after newer technology began changing the wider market. On paper, novelty often wins arguments. In life and death decisions, familiarity often wins instead. A weapon can be technically improved and still be the wrong choice for a man whose edge comes from exact repetition. Hickok's loyalty to what he knew was not backwardness, it was recognition. He had already built a complete shooting language around that pair of revolvers. The draw, the sight picture, the recoil impulse, the timing of follow-up, the confidence in where the shot would land when the pressure peaked. Abandoning that for trend alone would have meant trading mastery for theory. Plenty of men buy improvement. Far fewer can survive the transition period while relearning instinct. Hickok's answer appears to have been simple and hard to argue with. Trust the system that is already held under pressure. When a man's reputation is built on not missing in the moments that count, trust outweighs novelty. That trust was not theoretical. It had to prove itself in confrontation, and it did. Here, the responsible line is important. Not every story attached to Hickok deserves equal confidence, and not every tale told later should be treated as documentary fact. But the broad pattern is hard to miss. In real moments of conflict, the sidearms performed the work his legend claims for them. They came into action quickly. They rewarded control over panic. And they were most effective when he resisted the temptation to spray haste into noise. That is part of what makes the later 75-yard story so enduring. People remember the distance, but the deeper lesson is restraint. The revolver in practiced hands does not become magical. It becomes predictable. Hickok's reputation grew because observers saw that he was not just armed, he was settled. That steadiness, more than speed alone, is what made opponents feel they were already behind before the first shot broke. The visible pair was only part of the logic. Men living by reputation often worried as much about the moment before the obvious draw as the fight itself. In close interiors, around tables, in packed rooms, or in any place where hands disappeared below sight lines, layered defense mattered. A concealed or backup handgun, even with limited capacity and fewer comforts, changed the geometry of vulnerability. It gave the carrier one more answer if the primary guns were trapped by position, seized in a grapple, or simply out of reach in the wrong instant. Hickok understood the value of redundancy because public danger is rarely courteous enough to begin at ideal distance. The backup weapon did not have to be elegant. It only had to exist, hide well, and appear when the other man believed he had already solved the problem. That is loadout thinking at its most practical. Do not assume the main plan will survive first contact. Carry something for the bad angle, the crowded room, and the hand that starts moving under the table. Beyond the handguns, the loadout widened when the situation demanded range, power, or insurance. A long gun changed the fight when distance opened up, or when stopping power mattered more than speed from the belt. An edge tool remained the old frontier truth beneath the newer machinery. If every other layer failed, a blade still answered the brutal closeness of last resort. None of that makes the sidearms less central. It makes them more intelligible. The revolvers were the core because they lived on the body and traveled through daily uncertainty. The longer gun and the blade expanded the system outward. Each served a different problem. Distance, immediate defense, close struggle, public presence, private vulnerability. That is why Hickok's loadout endures as a serious subject instead of a costume subject. It was not a collection of dramatic objects. It was a practical arrangement built around likely threats, likely distances, and likely failures. Then came the public test that fixed the legend in national memory. The shot associated with a 75-yard heart hit. Strip away the retelling and the moment still carries its own force. At that range, with a revolver of the period, success is not the product of cinematic frenzy. It is the product of composure. The shot asks for a stable stance, a clean presentation, control over breath, and a refusal to rush the trigger. It asked the shooter to trust not just the gun, but the exact relationship between eye, hand, and known point of impact. That is where ballistics becomes personal. A weapon can have enough power, enough range, and enough accuracy on paper, but none of it matters unless the person behind it knows precisely what the gun does when the distance stretches farther than comfort. The reason that moment terrified people was not only that the shot landed, it was that it suggested Hickok understood his revolvers down to the edge of what most men would even attempt. Whether every part of the remembered story is perfectly preserved or not, the shot endures because it feels like the purest expression of his system. One calm decision, one familiar weapon, one result. As his career moved deeper into order keeping and public enforcement, the same gear had to solve a different problem. Open confrontation is one thing, managing unstable people in crowded spaces is another. A lawman's sidearms do not just answer a duel. They answer confusion, drunk courage, sudden insults, bad lighting, misread intentions, and the awful speed with which a crowd can turn one argument into many. In that phase, the signature loadout still made sense because it offered a blend of authority and readiness, yet it also exposed the cost of living by the gun. The more often weapons settle disorder, the more disorder learns to arrive armed. Every reputation that protects a man also paints him as a target. Hickok's loadout continued to function, but the burden around it grew heavier. That is the quiet truth beneath the famous image. Violence does not stay clean just because one man is exceptionally good at surviving it. Late in life, the body that had once made that system look effortless began to lose some of its edge. Health matters to gunfighting even when legend would rather ignores it. Vision, steadiness, fatigue, and reaction time are not romantic subjects, but they decide real outcomes. Hickok's late chapter shows the hard limit of mastery. A familiar loadout can compensate for many threats, but it cannot repeal decline. Even then, he appears to have stayed close to the system that had carried him through the years. That is revealing he did not reinvent himself at the finish. He relied on what he had always relied on. There is something almost severe in that loyalty. It speaks to a man who believed survival came from staying inside a proven pattern, not from scrambling for a new identity because time had changed around him. The tragic edge is obvious. The same faith that built his legend also accompanied him into the stage where legend could no longer protect him. And in the end, the system failed not because he forgot how to use it, but because vulnerability found him before the draw could matter. That distinction is essential. His downfall belongs less to a collapse of skill than to a collapse of position. A man can be masterful with familiar weapons and still die if the fatal moment denies him the chance to bring them into the fight. That is not contradiction. It is the final lesson. Loadout, training, and nerve all matter, but so do angle, awareness, timing, and luck. Hickok's death has lasted in memory precisely because it reverses the image people trusted. The feared shooter, the composed hand, the man who made distance look manageable was undone by exposure rather than incompetence. After that came the afterlife. Every frontier legend receives display cases, replicas, retellings, arguments over what is documented and what is embroidered, and endless attempts to separate the working gunman from the theatrical shadow. But the core answer remains remarkably stable. Wild Bill Hickok's loadout endures because it was coherent, matched sidearms, trusted carry, layered defense, practical expansion for distance and failure, and a mind disciplined enough to use all of it without panic. The myth grew because the system worked. The correction is that the system was human, not supernatural, and that in the end is why it still holds attention.